Welcome to DAO Deep Dives, where we interview DAO founders, core DAO contributors, and everyone else who works on the periphery of decentralized autonomous organizations.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are at in the world. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. Super excited to dive into the world of DAOs with you guys today for Valley DAO.
Thank you so much for having us on. And looking forward to chat about our project and how we're aiming to solve the problems in synthetic biology.
Likewise, doing great and excited to get stuck in.
Very cool. I think just a quick introduction to who you are as individuals, maybe how you got interested in this in the first place.
My shortest summary would be that I'm a synthetic biologist, now turned DAO contributor or founder. And I'm just super passionate about solving world problems. I think the main focus for me has always been climate and sustainability. And I've just been constantly searching out new ways that I can contribute to that cause and make an impact in the world. So that was kind of what led me to science, and that was what led me to Valley DAO successively.
I'm Albert Anis. I also have a background in synthetic biology, just like Morgan. Right after graduating, I delved into the world of venture creation. So working a lot with scientists in helping them translating their academic research into the real world. I got very interested in innovation ecosystems and started to learn more about all of the different stakeholders and parts of actually taking a piece of technology from academia and bringing it all the way into a commercial product. And quickly noticed that there are certain inefficiencies in how fast we can bring these innovations to market. And that's one of the things that ultimately led me to create Valley DAO together with the amazing community and the founders that I've met through the world of decentralized science and the world of discords and all of that. So it's definitely been an interesting digital journey.
Awesome. Thank you. And Albert, we'll stay with you. So we like to ask our guests, like, not what a textbook definition of a DAO is, but really from being involved in DAOs and having this be your day to day. And so really to you, what is a DAO? What is the interpretation of a DAO for you and what you do?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. I think about it every day. And really, depending on when you ask me this question, you'll probably get a different answer. I like to see them as playgrounds for mainly adults, but really, anyone can be part of this playground of people coming together and trying to focus and solve a particular problem, usually a problem that stems from some sort of systems level problem that needs something more foundational, more grassroots type of activities to solve. So playgrounds for adults, they're bazaars in a way. There's a lot of things happening all the time and people coming in, people coming out. So you have this inherent flux property of humans, of networks, of resources that always come in and always comes out. And they create this kind of dynamic feature of DAOs. And I think that's really cool. I think that's kind of like the future way of organizing ourselves, but also giving each contributor, stakeholder, the ability to have some sort of ownership of the process, ownership of the things that are happening. So for the first time ever, we're able to tokenize a contribution to a community. And that's kind of like one of the unique value propositions really of DAOs in comparison to traditional organizational structures.
Perfect. Exactly. And I love how you prefaced with it changes over time. That's like exactly what we're looking for. Morgan, what would you have to add?
Yeah, I completely agree with Albert's definition. And I would only add, I guess, from my perspective, it's about being intentionally collaborative. I think in a lot of what we do in the world currently and the systems that we have in place, there's this accidental collaboration. We're all being shepherded in the same direction, but no one really knows who's calling the shots or where we're going. And I think the difference in a DAO is that people come together based on these core beliefs, these core values, something they really want to achieve together, and then put themselves in a situation and start to design the systems, the interactions that allow them to fulfill these goals. Yeah, I completely agree. To me, it's like a living, breathing organism that's constantly changing and evolving, but it's about deciding to be something much bigger than an individual.
So, diving from what is a DAO in general to what is Valley DAO? Give us an intro for someone who might have never heard of Valley DAO. What do you guys do? What's the mission? What's the purpose?
Valley DAO is a community which is aiming to democratize access to synthetic biology technologies. And for people that don't know what synthetic biology technologies are, it's essentially the tools and techniques that we use to rationally design biological systems. So, for an example, let's go with beer or cheese, right? These are very well established biotechnological processes. But what you can do with synthetic biology is you can begin to cut and paste the genomes. You can start to play around with different expression patterns and different ways in which these organisms interact with each other and the substrates that they're in. What synthetic biology aims to do is to develop a framework as well as the tools and techniques that enable you to better design biological tools. Now, that can be for like producing cheese and wine, or it can be for solving global problems like bioremediation or producing fuels and chemicals from carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So what Valley DAO, I guess more specifically, is aiming to do is to help scientists with the commercialization pathway. So a lot of research is getting stuck in academia or even stuck in industry as well. And so what we're aiming to do is really help that get out of those silos and become really valuable technologies that people are going to be able to benefit from.
I would argue that not having beer or wine is a global issue, you know.
Definitely.
It is. It is. And also maybe something for the show notes. I saw a really good Kurt Sagat's video today about biology and particularly like biotechnology. I really like the way they explain it. They say it's like programming the language of life, right? And this language you can express various biological things, and those things, what synthetic biologists are trying to do is to create sustainable materials, sustainable fuels, more precise medicine, more microbes that can live in our soils to make our food more nutritious, restore the soil that we have depleted throughout the most recent decades. So happy to link that and we can put in the show notes. It's a really good intro to biotech.
So there's actually two questions I want to ask now. I want to ask, what's the meaning behind the name, if there is any?
Yeah, we usually explain what it means when somebody asks it, but otherwise we don't really talk about it. And the explanation is in valleys in general, they're very flourishing ecosystems. A lot of different things can grow, a lot of different animals can live there, and they have a very diverse biodiversity, basically, right? And with biology, you can grow everything, you can create these systems. And that's why we called it Valley DAO. So yeah, that's the explanation.
Fantastic. So you touched on it in the very beginning, I think, in your intros, but I would love to hear why you started this DAO and why does Valley DAO need to exist in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So why should Valley DAO exist, right? As we explain the potential of synthetic biology and particularly the impact it can have on the environment, how we build and feed and fuel our physical world, we need better systems for bringing these innovations to market. The current innovation ecosystem is inefficient and slow in different ways, right? And the things that we've identified that we believe are like the things that are slowing the ecosystem down is related to how early stage synthetic biology research is funded, and then also the gap in the know-how and the network and in the expertise of these academics to commercialize and translate this research. And then finally, the lack of platforms where academics can collaborate in a safe manner without risking their data or their results being breached or being copied by someone else. So those are the three main things that we've identified that we want to address with Valley DAO. So if we start with academic funding, the current, they spend around 50% of their time applying for grants when they could have spent that time actually working in the lab and with the things that they were supposed to do, what they signed up for in the first place. Also, these grant giving organizations usually have certain very strict criteria on what kind of research that you're allowed to do with these funds, which leads to many high impact projects that breaks the confinements of these restrictions not seeing the light of the day. And we could see this in a recent article that was released, and we can also maybe send that in the show notes, of how instead of academic science becoming breakthrough generating technologies, it's become an incremental discipline where we're making very slow improvements every year. And this is something that has been going on since I think it's 80s and 90s. And we believe that this has to do how we fund science. So what we want to do is we want to find high impact, early stage academic research that has the potential to change the ways of how we're doing synthetic biology and the resulting products that can come out from that. And we're using community to efficiently source these projects thanks to the network effects that we're creating by being a community that has a very low barrier to entry and low barrier for contribution. We get a very high flux of deal flow to these potential projects. The second thing, as I mentioned, is the lack of know-how and network and expertise to actually bring out these innovations from the university. Usually, there is a tech transfer office at the university, and they're responsible for commercializing the work at universities. Now, what many tech transfer offices have become is very efficient, very bureaucratic, and hard for academics to navigate and understand how they actually work. And at the same time, the academics themselves, they can't really do this on their own. So what this results in is in a lot of research results, a lot of data, a lot of potential impactful IP gets archived and shelved and becomes forgotten about. We have a slow funding system that is inefficient. And then at the same time, a lot of the research that is being conducted in universities never actually leave the confinements of the university. And how we, on the innovation front and the supporting academics in commercializing their work, that's one place that we come in with Valley DAO, is like through the network that we are creating and through the different subgroups, we can help these academics create a business plan for their work, help them recruit, for example, a CEO or a CSO or a COO to rapidly prototype companies, right? And then at the same time, we can get them connected with R&D partners and ultimately angels and VCs for later stage funding. So we have this kind of incubation style way of working with academics, and we can do it more efficiently because we're able to find the resources that we need through the network, while at the same time incentivizing our community members to participate and actually help out these projects in return for the native DAO token.
Just a really phenomenal answer. And so I guess as all this research gets compiled within Valley DAO, is it going to be perhaps like very easily searchable for all members so you can build on and iterate and things like that? Is that part of the plan?
Yes, exactly. Currently, how intellectual property flows these days. So intellectual property is a really big thing in biotechnology. And the problems with IP today, it's very slow in terms of how fast it can move, how it can be transacted, and also like price discovery, like what is the valuation of this piece of intellectual property, right? A really interesting framework that was developed by Molecule DAO that we're aiming to apply is called the Intellectual Property Non-Fungible Token, IP NFTs, which allows you to digitally represent a real piece of intellectual property on chain that you can, as simply as transferring one NFT token to another wallet, you can do the same thing with the IP NFT, and that's like a licensing process. And as you said, with the discoverability, it makes intellectual property much more searchable not necessarily searchable in the way that you can see the content of the intellectual property, because that's still hidden, right? It's not public. But you can still search for things such as, when was this thing invented? And who were the key inventors? And was this ever funded? And if so, who funded it? Has it been previously licensed in the past? But also, has it been accessed by anyone else? So all of these things are recorded in a public ledger. And the idea in the long term with these IP NFTs is that they become kind of like a repository for intellectual property, kind of like building blocks where somebody can search for them, find them, sub-license them, and maybe spin out a company. So the IP NFTs, they're not like this magical solution that will solve everything. They're a tool, and you still have to do the work to actually bring them to the market. And that's where I see the DAO and its network to come in and to fill all of different steps in the commercialization roadmap.
So this is really phenomenal. And I think that it's obviously well thought out, and I can see exactly how this works. I think like product market fit, if you will, is very obvious here. So beforehand, did you go through any major pivots or like different versions before you landed on this version of your DAO?
So to be frank, like, we're in a way sitting on the shoulders of giants. We've taken a lot of inspiration from VitaDAO and their model, right? And we were pretty fast in discovering that how VitaDAO was doing it for longevity research, the same way can be done for any scientific field that is suffering from the valley of death, which is most of the scientific fields, right? What makes it particularly interesting for synthetic biology as well is that synthetic biology is an inherently multidisciplinary field of science. It combines, of course, biologists, chemists, electrical engineers, computational engineers, physicists, and all of that. And a DAO can really bring all of those stakeholders to the table. So inspired by VitaDAO, and shout out to their community for setting the foundations for many decentralized science projects. We borrowed a lot of those principles, really. And I think one of the distinguishing factors between maybe VitaDAO and Valley DAO is how we look at intellectual property. Like, of course, we want to commercialize the intellectual property that arises in Valley DAO, like from the different research projects. But we also want to find ways of how certain aspects of this intellectual property can be made public in a sense to support the creation of commons and give also community members the access to this public facing IP so that we can have intra-network effects, right? Where all of a sudden members in the DAO start grouping up and work on their own innovation projects. And that to me is super exciting. And that is something that we want to build towards.
So with Pfizer coming in, speaking of Vita, how does that relate to Valley DAO, and what kind of things do you see surrounding big names or big players in the game coming in and working with DAOs?
Yeah. So I think it's really exciting, and obviously they've made a lot of fuss about it, and rightly so. I think it's exciting for both parties, right? It's exciting for VitaDAO because they're getting the traction and recognition they deserve for the work they're doing. But it's also exciting for Pfizer because they have all of a sudden access to this new segment of a market, or this new kind of microscope into the market, which is highly specialized, that can iterate very rapidly and is really efficient at sourcing deal flow. And yeah, I think it's really exciting for them. And I think there's definitely scope further down the line for Valley DAO doing the same thing. We have already had some interest on our first research projects for the generated IP. So already you've got kind of people coming at you from both sides. You've got the researchers that want access to the funding and want to do something really impactful, but then you've got the people that are going to be scaling those technologies who are also equally interested in this early stage research, but perhaps don't have the exposure or the capacity to fund it or conduct it themselves. So I think it really makes sense in the case of synthetic biology, because one of the biggest problems holding the technology back from commercialization is scalability and infrastructure. And that is because it just requires so much capital to, let's say, start an algae farm. It's like hundreds of millions of pounds. It is perceived to be a high risk investment, at least if you're starting completely from scratch. So I think it really makes sense for these big players to sit and wait for this technology to become available, maybe even define certain proof points that they want to see before they come in and invest, so that not only do you have them coming in at the right time, but you can also directly inform your researchers, hey, look, let's say BP or Shell are really interested in this project if you can prove these three things. And then instantly you're creating these new incentives that incentivize impactful research, but also get the investor appetite whetted.
Yeah, almost like a bounty or something. That's interesting. So I'll ask like a two-part question here. We like to discover what's the DAO's business model. And I think it's fairly obvious to us so far, but just like break that down. And then what's the legal structure of the DAO and why did you choose that legal structure?
When it comes to the business model of the DAO is, as I mentioned before, it's sourcing high impactful academic research projects with very high upside and de-risk them very early on through the different subject matter experts that we source to the community. And this is something that is quite difficult, for example, a traditional VC or a traditional fund or a grant giving organization, really, because they're limited in their knowledge, right? Maybe they have a couple of people in their network, but it's nothing compared to the amount of people that we can source through a DAO. Early on, we can de-risk these projects, and then we ultimately fund them through the treasury that we'll be raising. And these projects, we negotiate them with the university, and we aim to get exclusive rights to the generated intellectual property to ultimately enable this sovereign DAO governance framework. Because if we don't have exclusivity, it's quite hard to be autonomous in that sense. Once the license is negotiated and the project is funded, we get the rights to any future generated intellectual property. These projects, they take around 1.5 to 2 years to finish before they yield any results. And of course, they yield results on a rolling basis, right? So new results can come out every 6 months. But once the research project is finished, we evaluate the IP and we look at if this is something, for example, that can be sub-licensed to an existing company. So let's say we develop something that can sustainably produce palm oil in the same way that we ferment beer, right? That's super interesting for an industrial manufacturer of chemicals, right? Or foods. So that's probably quite interesting for them. So then if they want to license this intellectual property, then they would have to make a governance proposal to the DAO. And of course, we can help them make that, but to make it public facing for the community that this third party is coming in here and is really interested in getting a license from our community. And the community gets together, we discuss, we vote in a public setting, and then we reach some sort of consensus, right? And if we reach a positive consensus, then the company gets a sub-license and the rights to use that intellectual property in return for either a one-time payment, let's say, or a reoccurring royalty payment based on like 2% of or 3% of their net sales flows back into Valley DAO's treasury. So the licensing is one component of the business model. The other component of the business model is to incubate this intellectual property ourselves, right? For example, sourcing talent from the DAO network, developing the business plan through the network once more. With one research project that we have worked with at Denmark's Technical University, they already had a piece of IP, and we helped them in creating a company around it. So with the DAO network, we managed to get 70 applications for a CEO recruitment. We managed to recruit a CEO. We worked together with the CEO, onboarding him, developing the business plan together with him, just the initial things like an advisor, an incubator would do. And in return, we take 5% equity of that spinout. And then that equity is managed by the DAO treasury. So it's generating IP, licensing it, but also finding and sourcing academic research projects that already have potential, that are kind of like stuck in the valley of death, and we help them in coming out from there by providing them with our commercial expertise.
Go into the legal side just a little bit, because a lot of what you're saying is super fascinating. And I have a little bit of a background from an investment styles perspective. There's a lot of parallels I see. So give us an understanding on how you guys are structuring the legal side of this DAO.
So
Yeah.
how we're structuring the legal side and the real world side of things with this DAO space, and for Valley DAO particularly, is early on we were recommended to assign some form of legal wrapper to the DAO. And how we did that is through a Swiss entity, basically. They have very defined legal frameworks that DAOs can operate within. So we incorporated in Switzerland. And why incorporation is super important is if there is any future problem, the founders of the DAO and individual community members can't be held accountable, right? Or not in that sense, but you don't want to be sued personally by someone, right? That's common sense. It's this legal wrapper. And through that legal wrapper, we can interact with real world entities. So we can fund academic organizations. We can hold a startup equity, right? We can do an accounting and payroll and pay taxes and so on. So that's kind of like one layer of being compliant and working in a secure manner. The other thing is securities laws, right? Nobody knows exactly how to navigate those frameworks. We're seeing people being sued, larger organizations mainly, like Kraken and so on. I think it's what's really important there is complying in the best manner that you can. For example, don't sell a pre-mined token to your community, right? That's one way of breaking securities laws, because then you're selling something that already has been priced. So one way to maybe, and this is not any legal advice, but one way you could do it is through issuing fair. So through this auction, there is no pre-allocation to any founders, any previous investors, or any entities, right? Because then you're not selling anything that already has been priced by the market to somebody.
Yeah, so you're taking it into the next realm of what we like to talk about with our guests, which is do you have a token? How do you manage your community side of things? So let's dive in from the back end here, because you mentioned the token. It sounds like it's planned. You don't have it yet, but and you actually mentioned it throughout the conversation, Valley DAO will have a native token. Talk about the token a little bit, right? Other than a vehicle of ownership, and even that, how do you think about, like, what is Valley DAO's token for? What's the utility, if there is any?
All right. So speaking of tokens and the Valley DAO's token, right? We're going to call our token the grow token, because with biology, you can grow things. And its main two utilities are going to be kind of like base utilities, which is governance. So the token will give you the right to govern which projects that we ultimately fund, how we commercialize those projects, how we sublicense those projects, and the conditions that we sublicense those projects. So it creates a more inclusive way to conduct innovation and give people a sense of ownership of the direction that the community is going towards. The second base layer functionality is, of course, going to be incentives. So giving people the ability to have a direct stake and ownership of the Valley DAO network is super important to us, and we want to ensure that people can be rewarded in that way. The second two utilities are holding a certain amount of growth tokens, and we haven't really defined this yet, but we want to enable some form of exclusive access for the ability to an investor to invest very early on in Valley DAO spinouts. These IP NFTs, when we're in the process of incubating and translating in them and have an incorporated startup, holding growth token at a certain tier will give you the first right to access and view these companies before anyone else. And at some point in time, we also want to expand this to create fractionalized IP NFTs. So imagine a scenario where you have a piece of IP and there's a lot of developer interest from the community or from other places. They want to conduct a decentralized research project based on this IP. So what we can do is we can take an IP NFT, we can fractionalize it, right? Because it's all on chain. And then we can issue individual fractions of that IP, which give you certain rights to use the IP in your work. And to purchase those fractions, you will need to hold Grow. So Grow is going to be an accepted method of swapping between the fraction and the Grow token. So that's an additional functionality or utility, so to say.
I love that you have put a lot of thought into the tokenomics side of things, right? Because does every DAO need to have a native token? No, but if you do, you better make sure that it makes sense, right? So you mentioned the right to govern through the token. Give us an understanding of how you think about the governance system and how you apply these tokens. Is it a token weighted kind of governance, or you also mentioned NFTs from the IP NFT perspective? What's your plan for Valley DAO?
So it's going to be token focused. So essentially, how much grow you have will affect your decision making power. And now the reason behind that is because when you've got contributors being rewarded by the grow token for their contributions to the DAO, then over time they're going to become the people with the most context and the most trust in the community. And eventually that should confer some kind of higher weight in the decision making process, especially if they're a more senior member of the DAO that might have been there from the beginning. But as Albert mentioned earlier, the founders aren't taking any pre-allocations. So it's not as though it's going to be like 4 people calling all the shots. It's very much going to be distributed amongst the community, amongst all of our early contributors that have helped us get to where we are today. And that's based on, again, to come back to your question of why a DAO and why a token. It's what we're really trying to achieve here is fair and equitable access to all of these technologies and the decisions that surround them as well. So I think that core philosophy can only be done in this way. And yeah, we have constant conversations on different ways of doing things, and maybe there's some more experiments to be done in certain areas, but ultimately we're going with a system that works currently, and yeah, we're hopeful that it's going to lead to the right outcomes.
Yeah, certainly. I think from the early parts of our conversation, you defined it as a living, breathing, ever evolving system. And you said one thing about the token and the voting system, that it is token weighted, but people who have earned grow, right, should have more impact in the decisions, because implicitly what I'm hearing, grow is sort of a reflection of their reputation. Right? I'm a big fan of reputation systems. I guess the question there is, how do you earn, right? Because I think personally, if you earned it by showing a certain expertise, then it is a reputation token, essentially, right? Versus if you can just go out and buy it.
Yeah, exactly. So earning is almost entirely through direct contribution to the DAO activities. So we have a number of work groups. Each of those will have their own allocations based on the amount of treasury we unlock. But ultimately, those contributions will be decided on, or at least the value of those contributions will be decided on by the community through a governance proposal as well. Obviously, there are certain inevitable biases, like some highly technical or legal advice expertise is going to be more than a social media post, for example. That's an obvious one, but we're not necessarily sitting here beforehand and saying, oh, your contribution is going to be worth this much. Ultimately, it's up to the people that, all of this benefits, which is the community. So it will go through governance proposals to work out exactly what that is. But as I said, yeah, it's all directly coming from work and contributions to the DAO. And we have many avenues to contribute, and you don't need to be a scientist. I know we've talked a lot about the science and the technical stuff, but you don't need to be a scientist to provide value to the DAO. There's so many, I hate to call them soft skills because they're really not soft, but there's so many skills that surround the scientific ecosystem that are required to actually commercialize the research. And I think just quickly, that's one of the other problems that the DAO is solving, right? Is that there aren't enough software developers, there aren't enough business expertise in science in general. A lot of it's coming from the scientists themselves, and they're already within their fields being expected too much of. And so expecting them to then develop their commercial skill sets as well, and their marketing skill sets and their branding, it's too much. And I think the best work comes from people really drilling down and focusing on what they enjoy and what they're most skilled at. So yeah, the DAO is able to provide an element of that too. And that's one way for anybody essentially to get involved and contribute to the success of the science.
And Morgan, I think one of your original explanations of DAO from your perspective was something about collaborative efforts. So I think that's a perfect example of that. Let's jump into smart contracts a bit. How much of your DAO runs on smart contracts currently? Will that change in the future, and maybe how?
Currently, zero. And I think it's because of the nature of what we do. It's very difficult to put in strict quantitative rules to define the success or the completion of work. So a lot of what we do is going to be, it's going to be very difficult to implement that. I think the way smart contracts will come in is in the whole licensing and IP NFT transactional processes to really streamline and facilitate all of that, to make sure that people are paid royalties when they're due, or to make sure that people are credited with the work when it's licensed, even if it's something that might be open source, for example. I think a lot of work is being done in the decentralized science landscape as a whole to implement some of these tools in things like peer review and things like scientific publishing. Instead of having a citation and having to manually make sure you cite that person and it being impossible to trace if someone fails to cite you, then you can start to use things like ChatGPT and these generative AIs to figure out, okay, your work's been cited here, or someone's used your sentence or your data here, and then it can make sure that you're automatically accredited for that. That's not something that Valley DAO specifically is working on, but I think it's something that really excites me from a scientist perspective.
Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about your token economy, and especially how the Grow token is the native marketplace token to back all of these other various things in the future and will be what you're like swapping in and out of, I can certainly see how that's going to operate right in the future. For getting involved with your DAO, specifically with Valley DAO, how, if someone's maybe new to DAOs and someone's already contributing to several, do they have different approaches? Is there bounties, things like that? Like, how do they come in and get involved, especially from maybe even a beginner perspective?
Yeah, great question. Obviously, you can find us on all the socials and we will respond to almost everything. So feel free to drop us a DM or a question there. But ultimately, the best way to get involved is to go on our website, jump into the Discord and introduce yourself. Just like many of the other DAOs, just give us a wave, let us know what your skills are, what you're interested in, and we can help quickly and effectively find you the right place for you and for the DAO.
As a closing question, before we come to an end here, we always like to hear how our guests see the future of DAOs. And if from your angle or from a personal angle, from Valley DAO, however you want to answer that, where are we going? Why is this important for the future of humanity?
Great question. I think as the world becomes more and more digital and more people and companies and organizations realize that a lot of their activity can be conducted in a decentralized digital manner, being able to tokenize somebody's contribution and creating these kinds of like reputational systems are going to be increasingly important. At the same time, as we build more complex structures, innovation networks, or manufacturing supply chains, or what have you, governance is going to become an important mechanism for, okay, how do we control these different things? And a lot of traditional organizations are going to see that as a tool, right? And they will become Web 2.5 companies. They're using blockchain-based tools to implement in their Web 2.0 fashion way of working. So tokenization and efficient governance mechanism to create more like direct democracy structures.
And if I might add to that my own perspective, I think for me, it's about the future of work. And really allowing people to do the things that they love and build a career out of it. And I think the internet, or Web 2, again, if you want to call it that, has already brought that to some extent to many people. Now you've got people making their entire livelihoods off of YouTube and content creation on TikTok. And this is about employing those same strategies and bringing that lifestyle to people to do something. Not to say that, you know, YouTube and TikTok isn't affecting people's lives, but to do something really worthwhile, meaningful, and impactful. I think for many scientists out there, they're just hungry for knowledge. They just care about what they do because it excites them. They feel fulfilled and they enjoy, fueling that curiosity every single day. And I think with a DAO, you can really break down those restrictions and really enable people to just do it in a way that suits them. You know, rather than being employed by a university and having a strict contract, you can come and contribute to a DAO for a season and, you know, contribute to a research project and then maybe take a break, maybe go on a holiday. And, you know, you have that freedom to live the way you want to, but still do something really impactful as well.
This has been incredible. We really appreciate the phenomenal responses from both of you and getting to know Valley DAO. And our listeners, I'm sure, will extremely appreciate it. I think a lot of people think of DAOs in a much more simplified way, maybe, than deep science and biology and how that can affect how the world operates. And I know one of my favorite moments is talking about IP NFTs and the fractionalization of those to showcase ownership in specific IP. It's just really phenomenal. So thanks. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for being here.
Likewise, it's been a great conversation and looking forward to see what other podcast episodes come out from your show.
It's an exciting time to be alive.
It is. It really is.
There's the quotable.
I agree.
And that's a wrap. Sven and Solve are your hosts for DAO Deep Dives, a podcast about all things DAO. Thanks for tuning in. Till next time.